All right, welcome to Critical Wade Theory, and this is the quadruple D, and happy Thanksgiving as well. So, today we're going to be talking about how Trump is using violence yet again to justify bashing immigrants. Also, I'm going to get into the history of Ronald Reagan, and then Gerald Ford's biggest scandal and how its impact is still being felt today, even if seldom acknowledged by the press or even most anti authoritarian activists. So let's start with actually a little bit of breaking news here. So, according to the Daily Beast, the Afghan man alleged to have shot two National Guardsmen near the White House had his asylum approved by the Trump administration earlier this year, according to a report by CNN. So, I'm quoting the Daily Beast now. The suspect has been identified by multiple law enforcement sources and media outlets as 29-year-old Ramal, uh, Ramanullah Lakanwal. And according to CNN, fingerprints matched a man of that name who fled to the U.S. during the Taliban takeover of his homeland in 2021. The suspect, the outlet reported, had applied for asylum in 2024 and it was granted by the Trump administration in April 2025. So think about that. The Trump administration has blamed Joe Biden for this when it was actually Trump. Now, to complicate things, I don't want to spread the message that you should always deny political asylum or anything like that. That's not my point here. The point is simply that Donald Trump is going to be lying his stupid head off about this, like he does about so many other things. Technically, Joe Biden had nothing to do with this, right? It wasn't the Biden administration that granted the asylum, but he's still going to blame Biden for this. And a lot of Trump supporters, they're not going to be intelligent enough to actually look into the story and find out, oh, wait, it was actually not Joe Biden who approved this. And again, I don't want to send out the message that political asylum is always bad. Obviously, some people will commit crimes, and you have no way of knowing that they might commit crimes. So there's always going to be a gamble. And of course, native born citizens here in the United States can commit violent crimes as well. We've seen that all over the place. And in fact, it doesn't only happen in big cities, or it doesn't always get national media coverage or anything like that. But the point is, it was a lie when Trump said that it was Joe Biden who was responsible for granting asylum in this case. So, within hours of the shooting of two West Virginia National Guard reservists in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump released a video from Mar a Lago that mixed tribute, accusation, and policy threats. Before investigators released any confirmed details about the suspect or the motive, Trump argued that the tragedy proved what he called the, quote, single greatest national security threat, unquote, to the country. Now, he wasn't looking in a mirror when he said that. He was talking about, the shooting. He could have actually been looking in a mirror and been saying, I see before me the single greatest national security threat. But technically, that's not what was going on at the time. And he said authorities were holding, quote, an Afghan national, end quote, and he insisted the individual had been brought to the United States because of the Biden administration's handling of the 2021 withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, yet again, I hate to emphasize this too much, but he's trying to blame Biden for this. You know, that's a bit of a stretch, and it should be a stretch even for the dumbest of the Trump supporters out there. But a lot of those people, they just don't catch on. They don't do the investigative work that should be done when it comes to these sorts of issues, and they'll just believe whatever comes out of the orange idiot's mouth. In the United States, members of the National Guard can be deployed domestically. Though their involvement in policing has long been criticized by civil liberties groups for blurring military and civilian roles, Trump framed the reservist presence in the Capitol as part of a mission nobly fulfilled, is what he said, echoing language he's used since 2017 to justify aggressive internal security operations. If you want to call them that, I call it more of a fucking mess. And keep in mind that these National Guard troops who got shot at would not have likely been shot at if Trump hadn't deployed them. Now, I don't know all of the details here, but presumably, presumably these National Guardsmen were there because of Donald Trump. And rather than focus on the specific incident, Trump shifted quickly to a broader attack on immigration because, of course, he argued that the alleged shooters symbolized the dangers of refugee admissions in general. While most refugees and most immigrants are not violent, but that doesn't stop these idiots from bashing immigrants, and they do it all the time, doesn't matter what issue it is, they'll try to drag immigrants into it. And refugee vetting already involves multi layered screening by the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and intelligence agencies, so called intelligence agencies, and it's a process that typically takes years. After the fall of Kabul, most Afghan evacuees entered the United States under humanitarian parole, not the formal refugee program. And many analysts point out that both Democratic and Republican administrations have used parole not as an act of generosity, but as a way to maintain discretionary control. You have no lasting status, no structural guarantees, and a constant threat of surveillance. So, that's an interesting point here to consider. Trump also broadened his remarks to immigrants from countries entirely unrelated to the DC incident because, of course, he targeted Somali communities in Minnesota, the same people he previously accused of eating cats and dogs with zero evidence, zero accountability for those claims. It should have disqualified him from the presidency among the voters. They should have heard those comments and said, man, this guy's too stupid and too bigoted to become president. We need to vote for the other candidate. Despite the other candidate's flaws, at least he's not spreading vicious and stupid see through lies about immigrants. But in this little speech, Trump accused the Somali communities of ripping off our country. Well, I guess technically the cats and dogs statement was about Haitian immigrants, technically, but it's blended in with the Somali immigrant. Basically, if you're a non-white immigrant, Donald Trump is going to spread lies about you. And it follows a long pattern. During his first term, he attempted to end temporary protected status for Somalia, a designation the United States has granted since 1991 because of the country's civil war and the state fragmentation. Somalia's federal government exists, despite Trump's claim, but its capacity is weak, shaped by 30 years of conflict, drought cycles intensified by climate change, and the ongoing presence of armed groups like Al Shabaab. Trump's comment that Somalia has, quote, no laws, no water, no military, end quote, overlooks the country's formal legal system, its federal member states, and the fact that the Somali National Army operates with significant African Union support. Somalia's struggles reflect the predictable fallout of imperial intervention, resource extraction, Cold War proxy competition, and a global order that keeps weaker states dependent on stronger ones. Trump's language around immigrants mirrors earlier initiatives such as the 2017 travel ban and his administration's reductions to the refugee cap, which he lowered to record levels. His new push to re interview refugees already admitted to the to the United States fits a pattern of using administrative power to create insecurity among non citizens. And the approach aligns with a general state strategy, really: produce fear, sort populations, expand surveillance, and present crackdowns as necessary acts of protection. That's been happening for eons now, practically speaking. I mean, that's how authoritarianism happens. So the president repeated that the country will never bend or yield, in his words, invoking a familiar wartime posture. Critics on the left argue that such rhetoric serves mainly to justify state expansion, despite him claiming to be a conservative, who's in favor of small government or whatever. He's constantly actually seeking to expand the power and the role of not just local government and state government, but actually the federal government. What happened to states' rights? Well, when Trump's in power, states' rights no longer matter as much to these right wingers. And the critics note that violent incidents, before facts are even known, often become political currency for leaders who want broader policing powers and tighter border regimes. So basically, it's a recipe for authoritarianism. That's why, despite all these right wingers critiquing and condemning these violent attacks, whatever the source, they actually want them to happen because it gives them an excuse to attain more power. They will publicly posture as if they don't want violent acts to happen, but they actually crave them, and they want to create more social situations where they're more likely to happen because they want the power, and they like to inflict punishment. Basically, they're like sadistic freaks. And when Trump blamed the Biden administration only hours after the shooting, he demonstrated a tendency to speak before all the facts are known. And again, in this case, it was actually Donald Trump who is responsible for this person being free. Now, again, I want to reemphasize that I am not saying that all people who are seeking asylum are violent or anything like that. In fact, we're not mind readers. We don't know what will necessarily happen. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict all of these things. And in some cases, a person might not even have a previous criminal record or anything like that. So, at this stage, investigators have not released a verified account of what happened in Washington. The only details in circulation come from Trump's statements and emerging reports. And of course, Trump has historically mixed factual claims with speculation at best, but quite often he just will make stuff up. And, as we saw with the lies about the immigrants in Minnesota, claiming that they eat cats and dogs. And what is clear in this case is that the administration is already using the event to advance a sweeping immigration crackdown and to expand it, and it reaches far beyond any one case, and that fits neatly into a long tradition of governments turning isolated acts of violence into fuel for more control. All right, moving on to the next segment here. I'm going to be talking about the peripheral poophead of the week, Ronald Reagan. So, part of the reason for me choosing him in this case is, well, I haven't done him as a peripheral poophead of the week, and he definitely is part of how we got here, his presidency. Now, oddly enough, toward the end of Reagan's presidency, in his final speech, he actually was pro-immigrant. He seemed to favor general amnesty, in fact, and that's something that a lot of right-wingers seem to have forgotten about. But nevertheless, Reagan's legacy was not just one of kindness or anything like that. So Trump did know Reagan to some extent. Trump and wife Ivana met with President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan at a 1985 state dinner for King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. And I talked about that meeting before. And since then, Trump has retained close ties to the Saudi government, and that includes recently defending their government's murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, insisting that Khashoggi was a controversial figure, so therefore he needed to be, assassinated, I guess, according to Donald Trump. According to the President of the United States, who justifies the human rights abuses and actual murders committed by a murderous regime that is also an Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship. So, a theocratic leader who is a Muslim, despite Donald Trump's own Islamophobia, his Islamophobic statements that he's constantly been making, since well, basically since September 11th. And he, of course, ran for president as somebody who will ban Muslims from entering the country. Yet here he is in the pocket of a Islamic theocrat. So somehow Trump's own supporters don't get that. But they don't get the irony or the hypocrisy or any of that. It's a very strange thing to not criticize him over that. If you're an Islamophobe, or of course, even if you're not, like I'm not really an Islamophobe, but it seems like a pretty glaring contradiction. But anyway, moving on, I'm supposed to be talking about Reagan here. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in 1911 in the small town of Tampico, Illinois. He did not begin his public life in politics. He first made his name behind a microphone calling sports games in the early 1930s after graduating from Eureka College. Hollywood pulled him west by 1937, where he appeared in more than 50 films. And during his time in the industry, he twice headed the Screen Actors Guild, first from 1947 to 52, and again from 1959 to 1960. His leadership there marked a major shift in his worldview, especially as he cooperated closely with the FBI during the post war anti communist purges that targeted left leaning unionists and radicals within the film industry. So, for anti authoritarian critics, this moment signaled Reagan's alignment with state power over collective labor. He was basically considered a backstabber to cater to the Red Scare at the time. By the 1950s, Reagan was hosting General Electric Theater while touring GE plants as a motivational speaker. He was sort of like a Mickey Mouse for General Electric, I guess you could say. And these tours pushed him deeper into so called free market advocacy, setting up the ideological frame for A Time for Choosing, the 1964 speech that made him a conservative star. That speech propelled him into the governor's office of California in 1966. His administration raised taxes. That's right, he raised taxes, built a budget surplus, and ordered aggressive crackdowns on student movements, most visibly at UC Berkeley. So his approach to dissent during this period exemplified a pattern that he repeated throughout his presidency, treating popular mobilization as a threat to be subdued rather than a sign of any legitimate grievance. And why does that sound familiar? Well, it's not like an orange doofus has not been doing that as well. So Reagan sought the presidency several times, failing to unseat Gerald Ford for the 1976 Republican nomination. And I'll talk about Gerald Ford in a little bit, as promised. Anyway, Reagan won it 4 years later and then defeated Jimmy Carter in 1980 in a decisive victory, helped in part by voter frustration with inflation and the Iran hostage crisis. Now, obviously, the hostage crisis was a unique thing for the time, but it's further evidence that inflation is something that right wingers can really use to help propel them into office. And once in the White House, Reagan pushed a program that critics labeled a dramatic upward redistribution of wealth. Well, I should correct that a little bit. It's not just critics who label that, it's just a factual analysis. Wealth did get redistributed upward. Known as Reaganomics, it relied on steep tax cuts, deregulation, and a retreat from social spending. Although supporters claim these changes stimulated growth, wage stagnation and soaring inequality followed, and deregulating finance and industry laid the groundwork for the savings and loan crisis later in the decade. And these moves strengthened corporate power while weakening worker protections and public oversight. And yet again, why does that sound familiar? Well, it's part of a long-standing pattern by this point. And Reagan's first term also expanded the carceral state. His administration escalated the war on drugs, increasing federal funding for police and prisons, and the policies hit poor communities, especially Black and Latino neighborhoods, with devastating force. His administration's delayed response to the AIDS epidemic further deepened social harm, as activists documented widespread federal indifference while thousands died. Foreign policy under Reagan leaned heavily on military buildup and intervention. He increased defense spending to levels unseen since World War II and broke sharply with the anti nuclear arms race movement by accelerating the arms race against the Soviet Union. He authorized the 1983 invasion of Grenada, a move condemned by the UN General Assembly as a violation of international law. The same year, he survived an assassination attempt, an event that strengthened his political capital. And gee, why, why does that also sound familiar? So you're seeing a lot of parallels, possibly, if you're knowledgeable about Trump's history, of course. And he was reelected in 1984 in a landslide against Walter Mondale. Reagan spent much of his second term on international confrontation and negotiation. His administration secretly sold weapons to Iran and illegally funneled the proceeds to the Contra forces in Nicaragua, who were responsible for widespread human rights abuses. So I did touch upon that in some previous episodes here, but here's what's interesting about it that I should bring up again. Congress had banned this funding, the funding of the Contra forces, making the operation an explicit violation of U.S. law. So basically, Reagan was also a largely lawless administration. The Iran Contra affair illustrated the dangers of concentrated executive power and the ease with which states circumvent their own supposed legal limits. So again, these are legal limits that ordinary people wouldn't be able to surpass. If you break the law, if you're an ordinary citizen, they might lock you up and throw away the key. But if you're a president or someone in the president's orbit, you might be able to get away with some major crimes. And Reagan's government also orchestrated the 1986 bombing of Libya, because of course, and it increased tensions across North Africa and the Middle East. Yet, in a major shift, I suppose I might as well mention at least one positive thing here. Reagan eventually engaged Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and the two signed the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which removed an entire class of nuclear weapons from Europe. And Reagan left office in 1989. By then, he reshaped the Republican Party, entrenched neoliberal economic policy, and expanded the reach of U.S. military and so called intelligence operations. So his presidency deepened state authority while consolidating wealth, often at the expense of marginalized people, and international self determination. So it's basically how the right wing operates. And moving on to the third segment of the show, I said show kind of weird there. Show is what I meant to say. It said like show. Anyway, this is called the Fetid Fever Dream Flashback of the Week. And as promised, we're talking about Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford's biggest scandal is widely considered to be his full pardon of Richard Nixon on September 8th, 1974. It was not illegal, but it crushed Ford's credibility and created a public sense that political elites protect each other behind closed doors. So here's what happened. After Nixon resigned over Watergate, Ford became president. A month later, he granted Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for any crimes he might have committed as president. Ford insisted it was meant to help the country move on. Many Americans rightly saw it as a backroom deal that placed powerful officials above the law. His approval rating collapsed almost overnight, which is a good thing. It shows that people were paying attention. Even decades later, the pardon remains the defining controversy of Ford's presidency. So it really mattered for a lot of reasons. It short circuited accountability for a president who had abused state power. It signaled that high ranking officials could escape consequences that ordinary people would never avoid. Again, if you're an ordinary person committing crimes, good luck. You're going to need a good lawyer, and in a lot of cases, you wouldn't afford it. But in this case, you have to wonder to what extent, the Nixon administration was even worried about it. And well, I guess he was worried about it to the extent that he left office. So it was sort of a different era for that reason. If you committed crimes, you still might have feared accountability. But in came Gerald Ford, like Superman swooping down to solve this issue for poor little Nixon. And it deepened public distrust in government just when legitimacy was already fragile. So, as I often do in this show, I'm going to sort of look at how this scandal actually helps boost the anarchist perspective where they critique power. And so, from a wacky and silly Billy anarchist angle, the scandal is not simply about Ford's judgment, it's about the structure that made the pardon possible, right? So, an anarchist critique would argue, for starters, point number one, the scandal showcases how hierarchical power protects itself. The ability of one executive to erase another executive's criminal exposure sits at the heart of the problem. A system built on authority and monopoly over force naturally shields its upper tiers from accountability. Point number two, the pardon revealed the asymmetry between citizens and rulers. Nixon's abuses involved surveillance, coercion, and manipulation of state agencies. An ordinary person who committed even a fraction of that would face severe punishment. So the pardon made the double standard explicit. Point three, the event illustrates how the state prioritizes stability over justice. Ford said he issued the pardon to help the country move forward. Well, what a nice guy. But a goofball and dangerous anarchist type would argue that stability in a state system often means protecting institutions, reputations, and power networks, not protecting people. And what do you know? They would be absolutely correct in this case. Point number four, it reinforces the core anarchic claim that centralized, concentrated political power cannot be trusted. The scandal did not happen because Ford was uniquely corrupt. It happened because the system gave him the unilateral power to shield political allies, and because political elites shared incentives to keep each other insulated from consequences. And again, those are consequences that ordinary people would end up paying a price for. Point number five, the aftermath shows how little input the public actually has. Millions were angry, but there was no meaningful tool for the public to reverse or challenge the pardon. And this fits the scary and spooky anarchist view that representative democracy gives only the appearance of control while actual decision making remains centralized. So, on that point, I do want to elaborate and say that, of course, representative democracy does have some merit. I mean, you could argue that practically any system has some merit attached to it. But nevertheless, the danger here is that power likes to let itself get away with crimes. So it will do the old "you scratch my back, I scratch yours." Boy, I can't talk today. I almost said "scratch my brack," whatever the hell that means. But I guess I was mixing up the word "scratch" and "back" a little bit. So anyway, the point remains that power corrupts absolutely, and the fact is that we're not really in a unique era now. It's just uniquely noticeable, perhaps, the levels of corruption and the depravity and violence and all that kind of stuff. It's just a little bit more obvious than perhaps it has been in the past. And anyway, it's a scary place to be. And happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Enjoy your turkey or whatever you're going to eat. I suppose some of you might be vegetarians or whatever. But enjoy some time with your family. Let the troubles subside for at least a moment. And be thankful that we're not totally up shit's creek, at least not yet.